In this Exploring Nevada, we'll head east from Las Vegas through the stunning Valley of Fire to a fertile river valley that lies against the Utah and Arizona borders, just north of what is now Lake Mead. It's a land rich in historic and prehistoric activities, a land where 1,000 years ago an ancient people farmed, prospered, and then suddenly disappeared, leaving behind a wealth of archaeological remains and many unanswered questions. Much of their material culture has been safeguarded in the Lost City Museum created for this purpose in the small town of Overton at the northern tip of the lake. I'm Gwen Clancy for the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs, and we'll speak first with Kathryne Olson, who runs this state museum. She has spent years studying the Native American groups that have made this land their home over the past few millennia. What was this museum all about? Why was it created and when?
Okay, the museum was created in the 1930s, 1935 to be exact. During that time, they were planning Hoover Dam, and they realized that some of the archaeological sites that are in the area were going to be covered by the water of Lake Mead when it was formed. So the government sent in the Civilian Conservation Corps to do some excavations. And the artifacts that came out of those excavations were then housed in this museum that they built at that time, also by the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Behind us, Kathryne, there are some pueblos that we'll be looking at. What is the story on those?
Okay, those pueblos are situated on an actual Anasazi site. The Lost City sites go for 30 miles up and down the Moapa Valley that runs along the Muddy River here. And when they decided to build the museum, some land became available that had some of these sites actually on it, and they had the foresight to incorporate those sites into the museum exhibits rather than destroy them to build the museum. They built them in. They reconstructed these pueblos behind us on the actual foundations after they excavated the site, and they studied the material that came out of the excavations and were able to reconstruct the pueblos based on what they saw had fallen down into the ground.
Okay, and so those pueblos would be called reconstructions? Then?
Reconstructions on the actual foundations of probably a 11th century Pueblo site.
Okay, and also there's a place over there that we can show some footage afterwards of it. There's a hole in the ground in front of your museum.
Yes, there is.
People keep wandering over there to look into that hole in the ground. What is that?
A domed hole in the ground. That is a pit house, and that was actually another living structure that was located right here. It's an earlier structure than the Pueblos. When the people first settled in this valley and began farming, they're people we call the basket makers, and they lived in these pit houses, which they dug down into the ground and placed a dirt and wooden structure over the top, a dome, and this was the first housing that the people had. And
what time period are we talking about there?
We would be talking after the year 1 AD up until around 600 AD.
Let's talk about the Anasazi for a minute, and I understand there's different terms for the Anasazi.
The common term has been Anasazi, and it's still in use in a lot of places. We use it in our museum still. It's being slowly replaced by other terms. Some of the modern-day Native Americans feel that the term Anasazi is not really fitting, that describes who their ancestors were, so the word ancestral Pueblo is being used in many areas and may someday replace Anasazi in the literature. Right now they're both being used.
Okay, so Anasazi or ancestral Pueblo, and these people came here maybe roughly, we don't know for sure, but 2,000 years ago?
Around there,
And then mysteriously disappeared 800 years ago, which is a big mystery still, and it's why this place is called Lost City. What is your take on it? I know you've studied a lot. What do you think happened to these people?
Well, there's a lot of theories. In the past, probably the most popular theories were drought and disease. I think now anthropologists, archaeologists are trending towards more social upheavals that were occurring throughout the Southwest at the same time. Droughts did occur, but they occurred other times too, and they always returned. Disease, the same story. We don't find, a lot of evidence of disease, but the anthropological theory now is that there was social changes going on, that were making it difficult for smaller areas to survive, and that eventually all these people gathered in much larger areas, like where the Hopi Indians are today and the Rio Grande Pueblo people.
To get an overview of the land where these ancient people once lived, we drive south a few miles from the museum, up onto a dry mesa. Our guide is museum archaeologist Eva Jensen. Eva, let's start out by saying where we are. Can you get us oriented in terms of where Las Vegas is and the states that we're looking at?
Okay, great. Las Vegas is probably about 50 miles in that direction. And Arizona are the mountains that you can see behind us here. Not too far, another 40 miles in that direction.
And we've got Utah that's kind of up in that direction.
Yes. We're standing right now overlooking the Moapa Valley, and the museum is in Overton, which is in the valley here. And the archaeological sites which really created the museum extend for the length of the valley here, about 30 miles worth of Puebloan ruins. The sites that were located in this valley, up and down the Moapa Valley, there are hundreds of sites. We probably don't even know where they all are yet.
And so if we could push a button right now and be back in the 30s, what was happening? Of course, there was a lot of excitement about building Hoover Dam.
When they did the surveys and discovered where the waters of Lake Mead would rise to, they realized that a lot of archaeological sites would be impacted and in fact flooded by the waters of the lake. And so there was a great urgency to excavate these sites to preserve this history of the past.
So what we're going to do next is visit a site that is representative of the archaeological sites that they were excavating back in the 30s. And where is that site?
That site is located sort of on the bench, a little bit above the town of Overton that you can see in the distance there now.
Okay, not too far from the museum.
Really, the interest in the archaeology of the area began in the 1920s, and the governor of Nevada at the time, Governor Scrugham, was really kind of a forward-thinking individual. He brought in professional archaeologists to look at this particular area, and that's when the archaeology began. And really, the Hoover Dam wasn't even considered at that time. But it was later on when they were concerned about the sites they had found earlier, and they had really a mad rush to excavate a lot of sites and preserve this 1,000-year-old culture that they were finding here. So the Park Service at the time contracted and brought in the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the boys from the CCC did a lot of the excavation under the direction of M.R. Harrington, an archaeologist that was hired by the state of Nevada.
And I suppose that it wasn't like the waters were rising quickly, but they didn't really know how much the water would rise, so they must have had a sense of urgency also about getting things out of the ground and saved.
Right. Well, actually they had pretty good engineering reports and survey reports that measured the elevations of where the lake could be. And so they worked very feverishly on the sites that were lowest. This wasn't in danger at that time, and so this particular site is representative of those sites, but it still remains because the lake didn't get here.
Well, if we could be transported back to 1080, Eva, what would people be doing here on this piece of land?
Well, this is just a nice little unit pueblo. It was probably occupied by an extended family, maybe. And the purpose for the people being here in this valley is this is a fairly mild area comparatively in southern Nevada, and there was a flowing stream. So the people that were living here were farmers. They were farming full-time, and part of their activity, their daily activities, would have been collecting and grinding corn. Many of the rooms in these pueblo units are dedicated to storage. They grew their corn, they stored enough food so that they could be self-sufficient. There wasn't any other place for them to go to get their food.